The great steel hall of the orbital station was bright with white light and filled with the noise of voices and footsteps as the new cadets stood in long rows, waiting for the next order. And in the middle of the noise came bursts of laughter that echoed against the walls. The laughter was aimed at one person, a young man standing alone near the end of the line. His name was Jace, and on his back he carried something that looked out of place in the sea of shining metal and smooth armor. It was an old backpack made from faded green fabric, its edges worn, its straps frayed, and the color uneven from years of use. And around him the others wore sleek survival harnesses with flashing readouts and auto-adjusting straps. Gear that looked new and powerful, and yet Jace stood silent with a strange old pack resting against him like it belonged there. The others whispered and smirked and traded jokes loud enough for him to hear. They said it looked like a relic from a museum. They said it would fall apart before the first hour of the test. They asked if he found it in the garbage. Jace said nothing. He only rested one hand on the pack's side, as if it were alive, as if it could feel the jeers, and his eyes stayed on the floor as the voice of the lead instructor filled the hall. The instructor's boots rang on the deck as he walked past the rows, tall and stern with a scar down his cheek, his voice sharp and without warmth. He told them today was the start of the survival exam, the final test before they could earn the right to serve beyond the safety of the fleet walls. And the test would take place on the dead world below the station, a world where storms and shadows swallowed the careless. He told them each would be sent down alone. Each would have to last until the extraction signal was given, and they could only carry what they had on their backs now. No resupply, no contact, no rescue unless they made it to the end. And a hush fell across the crowd, though the hush did not last long, because the cadets looked again at Jace, and some of them laughed once more, as if the danger ahead was not real, as if the old pack was the funniest thing they had seen all cycle. One cadet, a tall one with polished armor, stepped closer and tapped the side of Jace's bag with the end of his sleek energy spear, asking if it even had any real equipment inside. Maybe just a few rags and an old canteen. And Jace lifted his eyes for a moment, the look in them sharp and cold. But he still did not speak, and the tall cadet chuckled and walked away, satisfied with the attention. The instructor's voice cut through again, telling them to line up on the launch platform, and the floor beneath their boots began to hum as the clamps released. Overhead the great bay doors began to slide open, revealing the dark stretch of space, and far below the broken curve of the dead planet, its surface scarred and cracked, its sky thick with the brown haze of storms, and the hum grew louder until it was a deep roar in the bones. Jace stepped into his place in the line, feeling the weight of the backpack steady against his spine, the fabric rough under his fingers, and he thought of the man who had given it to him years ago, a man who had walked on worlds like this one and had come back when no one else had, a man who had whispered to him about places where the ground itself could kill, about nights when the stars vanished and the air turned to poison, about the things that waited in silence, just out of sight. And he remembered the final words spoken in a voice like gravel, telling him to keep the pack close, always close, and never let it out of his reach. The others shifted impatiently, their armor making small clicks and whirs, their faces confident, some even grinning at the thought of the challenge. They trusted the glowing screens on their gear and the weapons clipped to their belts. They trusted the machines to guide them and feed them and keep them alive. But Jace trusted something else, something that did not hum or blink, something built in a time before all this. The instructor raised his hand, the signal clear, and the platform shook as the launch began. There was no countdown, only the sudden drop as the clamps released fully, and the platform fell away from the station toward the planet, the wind of re-entry screaming against the shields, the heat turning the edges of their vision red, the sudden press of gravity slamming into their bodies as they descended faster and faster. The laughter was gone now, replaced by the sound of the storm outside, a deep rumble that rose like an approaching wave, and Jace held onto the straps of his backpack as if the storm were reaching for him, his mind silent, his heart steady, his eyes fixed ahead as the surface grew closer and closer until the shapes of jagged rocks and swirling dust were clear through the haze. The instructor's voice came one last time through the static, cold and final, telling them that the survival test had begun, and that from this moment they were on their own. No rules, no safety, only the truth of the planet, and in the next breath the platform split open, the cadets falling into the storm below, each carried by the strength or weakness of what they had brought with them, and Jace fell with the old backpack still tight against him, its weight somehow both heavy and comforting, its secrets waiting for the moment they would be needed. The air hit him like a cold fist as he landed, the thin wind biting against his skin even through the worn fabric of his gear, and the ground under his boots crunched with a strange brittle texture, as if the soil had long ago died and turned to ash. Above him the sky was a heavy swirl of purple and brown clouds rolling over each other in endless motion, and in that sky strange flashes of pale light flickered, without sound, like ghostly storms trapped in silence. Around him the other cadets were scattered, each hitting the ground in their own landing zone, some stumbling, and some landing perfectly thanks to their advanced stabilizers, their armor still gleaming under the strange light, and already a few of them moved with the easy confidence of people who believed they owned the ground they stood on. They began to check the readings on their visors, their weapons humming faintly, their built-in drones flying out ahead to scan the landscape, and one of them called over the comms to form small groups for safety. But the wind carried the words away almost at once. Jace kept low, pulling the straps of his old backpack tighter, as if the world itself might try to take it from him. He crouched down and opened the pack, just enough to take out a small metal canteen and a hand crank purifier, the kind most people would laugh at, the kind that required time and effort and had no glowing indicators to say if it was working. He found a patch of shadow beside a jagged stone and crouched there, pulling in a scoop of the planet's dust-tainted water from a shallow depression left by the last storm. The purifier clinked softly as he worked the crank, and the noise was comforting in a strange way, a reminder of a time before the galaxy had turned everything into machines that could fail with a single glitch. From the corner of his eye he saw one of the cadets wave at him, grinning inside a polished visor, holding up a sleek auto filter and making a mocking gesture of slow-turning hands, as if cranking an invisible handle. Then the cadet turned away, walking into the open with his group, their gear shining like a challenge to whatever might be watching from the shadows. Jace took a drink from the canteen, the water cold and clean now, and as he swallowed he felt the ground beneath his knees shift ever so slightly, like the tremor of something large moving deep below the surface. He froze, pressing one hand to the dust, feeling it vibrate in a slow rhythm, and then the vibration faded again into stillness, as if it had never been there, though the air seemed to hold its echo. The wind rose in sudden sharp bursts, pulling thin veils of dust into the air and blurring the horizon until the rocks and distant hills became vague shapes. Some of those shapes seemed to move against the wind, slow and deliberate, like living things that did not care about the storm. Jace adjusted the straps of his pack and began to move, keeping close to the jagged stone formations for cover, his boots sinking slightly into the dust with each step. Far off to his left came a sudden shout, high and sharp, and he turned just in time to see a figure vanish into the haze, one of the cadets gone in an instant, the group around them scattering, weapons raised, calling into their comms with rising panic, their voices breaking into static as the storm swallowed the signal. Jay stayed where he was, his heart beating slow and steady, his eyes scanning the dust for signs of movement, but all he saw were faint impressions in the ground, large and uneven, leading away into the murk. The air carried a faint smell now, sharp and metallic, almost like burned wires, but with something sour beneath it, and it clung to the back of his throat, making him want to cough. He pulled out a cloth mask from his pack, a simple thing, just fabric and stitching, yet it filtered the air well enough, and as he breathed through it he felt the haze sting less against his eyes. He watched the horizon again, waiting for the next movement, listening to the storm. Through the shifting curtains of dust a shape emerged, tall and angular, moving with slow precision. At first he thought it was one of the cadets, but the way it turned its head was wrong. Too smooth, too fluid, and the eyes glowed faintly like coals buried deep in embers. Jace kept still, lowering himself until the dust almost covered him. The shape moved past without pause, its legs ending in long-jointed points that barely touched the ground, and it seemed to taste the air as it walked, its head turning toward where the cadets had gone. The wind gusted hard again, and the shape vanished in the swirl. Jace rose slowly, his knees stiff from crouching, and began to move toward the opposite direction, following the jagged ridge lines. He did not try to call out. He knew sound carried strangely here, and too far carried to the wrong ears. The ground rose into a slope of black rock, its surface rough and cold to the touch, and from the top of the rise, he could see farther, though the haze still blurred the far edges of the world. Below, in a shallow valley, the scattered figures of cadets moved like insects under glass, their weapons raised, firing into the storm at something unseen, flashes of energy lighting the air in short bursts. And then the light stopped, replaced by silence and the slow rolling sound of dust sliding across stone. Jace crouched behind the rock, watching, until the silence grew too deep and heavy. A shadow moved at the edge of his vision, and when he turned his head, he saw it again, the same long angular form, but this time it was closer, its head tilted in his direction, the glowing eyes steady and unblinking. It did not move toward him. It simply stood there, as if measuring him. The wind pulled more dust between them, and when it cleared, the thing was gone, leaving only faint marks in the ground that faded with each breath of the storm. Jace reached for his pack again, pulling it closer to his chest, feeling the weight inside, the familiar balance of items he had carried for years, and he thought of the warning his grandfather had given him long ago, the words pressing into his mind with new weight, telling him that not all things in the wilds were enemies, but not all were friends either. And some were simply watchers waiting to see if he would survive or join the others in the dust. The storm thickened around him, muting the world into shades of gray and purple, and in that strange silence, broken only by the hiss of wind, he began to move again, step by careful step, each foot placed with purpose, his path winding between stones and low ridges, always keeping one eye on the ground for the faint tremor that might return, and one eye on the shifting shadows for the watchers in the haze. The planet felt alive beneath him, not in a warm or welcoming way, but like a deep, slow heartbeat hidden under layers of dust and stone, and Jace knew that every beat was counting down to something, though whether it was his end or the end of the others, he could not yet tell. The storm came without warning, a wall of swirling dust rolling over the horizon like a living thing. It swallowed the valley and the sky at once, turning day into a dim red twilight where the air itself felt heavy and the light faded into a strange haze. The sound of the wind rose from a low hiss to a deep growl that shook the stones around Jace, and each gust carried fine grit that stung his skin and bit into every gap in his clothes and gear. The world shrank to only a few steps in every direction, and beyond that was nothing but moving shadows and swirling dust. Jace crouched low beside the jagged ridge, pulling the cloth mask tighter over his face, the old fabric holding strong against the grit, the air through it dry but breathable. He knew storms like this could strip the outer layer from unprotected skin if someone stayed exposed too long. He kept one hand on his backpack as he moved along the ridge, his eyes half closed against the grit. Every few steps he stopped to listen, because sometimes the storm carried sounds that did not belong to the wind. In the thick haze ahead came the faint whine of powered armor servos. One of the cadets was nearby, their outline faint and flickering like a ghost as they moved through the storm. Jace raised a hand, but did not call out, because another sound had followed, a soft scrape, almost like metal on stone, but too fluid, too careful. He watched the shadow of the cadet pause and turn as if hearing it too. Then in a blink something moved fast through the haze, a darker blur against the dust, and the cadet's shape vanished into the storm, leaving only the sound of the wind again. Jace felt the ground shift beneath his boots, a faint tremor, like a deep breath rising from under the surface, and he remembered the way it had pulsed before in slow patterns. But this one was sharper, more deliberate. He stepped away from the center of the ridge toward a cluster of stones that broke the wind slightly, pulling himself into the narrow space between them, crouching low and steadying his breathing. Above the roar of the storm, he thought he heard the faint crunch of footsteps, moving closer, too heavy for the wind to carry far, and too slow to be the random movement of debris. The dust thickened around him until even his own hands looked like shadows, and in that murk a pair of dim orange lights appeared ahead, low to the ground but moving with strange precision. They grew brighter with each step until he could see the faint outline of long legs and a segmented body. the legs ending in sharp points that left almost no mark in the dust, the head turning in small jerks as if sniffing the air, the eyes burning faintly like coals buried deep. Jace stayed completely still, knowing that movement could be seen even through the storm, and the creature passed within a few steps of his hiding place, the sound of its joints clicking faintly under the roar of the wind. When it was gone, the wind shifted suddenly, changing direction in a way that made the dust slam sideways into his shelter, forcing him to shield his face with one arm. The storm's howl rose higher, almost like a scream, and the shadows in the dust seemed to twist into strange shapes, some of them towering and jagged, others crawling low to the ground. He began to move again, choosing each step carefully, following the memory of the ridge line's path, even though he could barely see it now. Each movement felt slower as the grit filled the air and the weight of the storm pressed down. A flicker of light appeared ahead, pale blue and weak but steady. He moved toward it cautiously until he saw the source, one of the cadets' drones, its lights dim, its surface scratched and pitted from the grit. It lay half buried in dust, its rotors twitching weakly, as if trying to lift but failing. The air smelled faintly of burned circuits. He crouched and pulled it free, turning it over in his hands. The display showed static and fragments of warning messages, but one of them caught his eye, an alert reading proximity breach, followed by an unreadable set of numbers. He tucked the broken drone into his pack and moved on, his boots sinking slightly deeper now, as if the ground beneath was softening. Each step came with the faintest vibration that grew more noticeable the farther he went. Then it stopped all at once, replaced by silence so heavy it seemed to press against his ears. The storm still roared, but beneath it there was nothing. No shifting grit, no distant echoes, nothing but the feel of something watching unseen. A new shape began to form in the haze ahead, taller than a human but standing upright, the outline broad and strong, its arms long and ending in shapes too thin to be hands. It did not move for a long moment, and neither did Jace. Then, with a slow turn of its head, the figure stepped backward into the storm and was gone as if it had never been there. He could not tell if it had been flesh, metal, or something in between. The wind eased for a moment, the haze thinning just enough for him to see the ground ahead drop into a shallow hollow, its edges marked with strange patterns in the dust, long curves and spirals, as if drawn by something moving in circles. He approached carefully, keeping to the higher ground, and from there he saw something in the center of the hollow, half buried in grit, a long shard of dark crystal, its surface faintly pulsing with a deep red glow that seemed to match the earlier rhythm of the tremors beneath the ground, each pulse slow and deliberate, like the heartbeat of something sleeping far below. He hesitated, the glow pulling at his eyes, and for a moment he thought he could hear a faint hum from it, almost like a voice too far away to understand. The wind shifted again, and the hum vanished, replaced by the return of distant scraping sounds, closer this time. He stepped back from the hollow, his boots making no sound over the dust, and in the corner of his vision he saw the faint orange eyes again, moving low along the ridge, searching, the shape of the insect, like form partly hidden by the haze, but close enough now that he could see the dust swirling around its legs in small spirals. The storm began to build again, the wind rising with sharp bursts that made the grit swirl, so thick it was like trying to walk inside smoke. Jace moved toward a narrow split in the ridge where two walls of stone formed a small overhang, enough to break the wind. He crouched inside and pulled the straps of his pack tighter, his hands brushing over the familiar shapes within, the tools and relics that had weight and purpose, his mind tracing each item by memory, his breathing slow and steady as the shadows moved outside, waiting for the wind to break again, waiting for the watchers to decide if he would remain unseen or become another piece of the dust. The storm began to fade as the light in the sky shifted toward a dim burnt orange, and the horizon deepened into shadow. The wind still carried dust, but now in thin streams that drifted like smoke and curled around the edges of stone. The land was quiet except for the soft hiss of grit moving over rock and the distant low rumble that Jace had learned not to ignore. He stepped out from the shelter of the overhang and kept his head low, scanning the ridge line for movement, his boots sinking slightly into the fine powder that coated the ground. The air tasted dry and metallic through the cloth mask. In the fading light the world seemed even larger, the jagged hills stretching into the distance, their shapes now dark silhouettes against a sky that looked heavy with unseen storms. Jace moved with careful steps, his hand brushing the old straps of his backpack as if the contact could steady him. He knew night was coming fast, and on worlds like this night was not a simple absence of light, but a change in the entire nature of the place. Predators moved differently. The temperature could drop, enough to kill the unprepared. The air could grow thin or strange, and in the dark the watchers he had glimpsed before might not remain in the distance. He found a shallow crevice in the side of a rock wall, its entrance narrow but wide enough to squeeze through. Inside it opened into a space, just large enough for him to sit and keep his back against stone. He set the pack down and began to work in silence, pulling out a set of collapsible rods that fit together into a small frame, a sheet of reinforced fabric that could be tied to the rock to block the wind. His movements were steady, his fingers practiced, each knot tight, the fabric muted. The hiss of the grit and cut the draft. The air inside the small shelter already felt less harsh. From the pack he took a small metal box, its surface scratched but strong. Inside were dried rations wrapped in paper and a compact stove that burned slow with a faint blue flame. No noise, no scent to carry into the air. He poured a little water from his canteen into a dented tin cup and set it over the flame, watching the steam rise slowly in the dim light, his mind half on the task and half on the silence outside, listening for the scrape of movement, for the hum or tremor that might signal something coming closer. A sudden faint whisper of sound broke the quiet, not from the wind, but from something passing near the shelter. He froze, the cup of water trembling slightly in his grip. Through the narrow opening in the fabric, he saw only shifting shadows, one of them longer than the rest, stretching over the ground with a slow, deliberate pace. He reached into the pack and drew out a flare, its casing old but sturdy, his thumb resting against the striker. The flare was not meant for rescue. It burned too fast and too bright, meant instead to blind whatever eyes looked into it. He waited without moving, the shadow passing the entrance before melting into the wider darkness, the sound fading as if the thing had never been there. Jace returned to the cup, taking a slow drink of the warm water, the heat easing the dryness in his throat. He unwrapped a ration and chewed in silence, the taste bland but enough to keep his mind sharp. When he finished, he cleaned the cup with a small strip of cloth and packed everything away again, leaving nothing loose. The night outside deepened into a heavier darkness, the last traces of the orange light gone, the stars hidden behind thick clouds, and with the dark came a colder wind that pressed against the fabric of the shelter and made it ripple softly. From somewhere far across the hills came a sound that was not wind, a low call that rose into a warbling pitch. It carried for a long time, echoed once, then was answered by another from the opposite direction. The calls repeated, slower now, as if moving apart or fading into the distance. Jay stayed awake, eyes open in the dark, his body still except for the slow rhythm of his breathing. The ground under him gave the faintest pulse again, the same deep, slow beat he had felt before it passed through the stone into his bones, then faded once more, leaving him wondering if it was the land itself breathing or something beneath it. He must have drifted in that edge between waking and sleep when a soft noise pulled him back, a sound close this time, the whisper of fabric moving. His hand went to the backpack without thought, fingers closing on the top strap, and his eyes adjusted just enough to see a shape crouched at the edge of the shelter, its outline too small to be the tall watchers and too still to be moved by wind. For a long moment neither of them moved. Then the shape leaned forward slightly, the faint glow of something in its hand catching his eye. He saw the shard, the same dark crystal with its slow red pulse, resting in the palm of the figure. The figure tilted its head, then in one fluid motion placed the shard into the open flap of his backpack and withdrew, vanishing into the night without a sound. The air inside the shelter seemed colder now. Jace reached into the pack and pulled the shard out, its surface warm despite the chill, the pulse steady in his palm, and as he held it he felt a faint tremor beneath him grow stronger for just a moment before settling again. He wrapped the shard in a piece of cloth and placed it deep inside the pack, tightening the straps and setting it beside him where he could feel its weight against his leg. The hours stretched on, the cold creeping deeper. He pulled his coat tighter and sat with his back against the rock, the wind outside rising and falling in long breaths, each rise carrying faint scents he could not place, metallic and sharp like before, but mixed now with something almost sweet that made the air feel heavier. Once or twice he heard distant movement, quick steps that came and went, never lingering long enough to approach, the kind of movements that kept their distance, yet made sure he knew they were there. When the first pale light began to seep into the sky, it was thin and weak, the storm clouds still covering most of the heavens, the dust in the air catching what little light there was and turning it into a dim glow. Jace loosened the knots, holding the fabric at the shelter's entrance, and let it roll down. The wind had shifted again, carrying the grid in a new direction. The air was still cold, but no longer biting. He stepped out and looked over the ridge line. The land below stretched out in muted colors, the shapes of rocks and hills, softened by the morning haze. No sign of movement except for a few drifting streams of dust that coiled across the valley floor. He adjusted the straps of his backpack, feeling the shards weight inside, and took one last glance at the shelter before turning toward the valley, his boots making soft prints in the dust, the wind already moving to cover them. The faint hum of the shards seemed to echo in his mind as he walked, a sound that was not entirely sound, a reminder that whatever had placed it in his bag had not acted by chance. And somewhere in the vast silent stretches of this world the Watchers were still moving, waiting for the night to return. The morning light was weak and the sky above remained heavy, with thick clouds that moved in slow waves, as if the entire sky was an ocean rolling overhead. The air carried a strange weight that made each breath feel like it was pressing into his chest. Jace kept moving along the ridge line with careful steps, the dust under his boots shifting in small streams as the wind swept across the stones. The shard inside his backpack seemed to give off a faint hum that he could almost feel through the straps. It was not loud but steady like the slow beat of a hidden drum deep in the earth. He stopped near a sharp bend in the ridge where the ground dipped toward a narrow canyon. The walls of the canyon were jagged and dark, streaked with strange markings that looked too deliberate to be carved by wind or water. He crouched low and traced one with his gloved finger. The surface was smooth and warm despite the cold air, and the warmth seemed to pulse faintly in time with the shard in his pack. The sensation made him pull his hand away and scan the canyon floor. The light there was dim, and the dust seemed thicker at the bottom, curling upward in slow, lazy spirals, as if something below was breathing. Jace stepped back from the edge, the hum of the shard growing slightly stronger, as if warning him away. He adjusted the straps of his pack and turned toward a cluster of rocks to the east, moving in their direction with quiet, measured steps. The land beyond them sloped down toward a flat stretch of cracked earth that glistened faintly in the dim light, and as he drew closer he saw that the surface was not wet but coated in a fine layer of crystal dust, each fragment catching the light and reflecting it in tiny red flashes that seemed to move when he shifted his head. From far off came the sound of energy weapons discharging in rapid bursts, the echoes bouncing off the stone and carrying through the wind. He dropped to a crouch and moved behind the nearest rock, peering around its edge to see figures moving in the distance, a group of cadets firing into the haze at shapes that darted in and out of sight. The flashes from their weapons lit the air in short bursts, revealing brief glimpses of long angular limbs and eyes that glowed with the same dim orange light he had seen before. The attackers moved with precision, never staying in the open for more than a heartbeat before vanishing back into the storm. The cadets' formation broke quickly, their voices shouting through calms that cut in and out with static. Their sleek gear and bright armor, now dulled by dust and streaked with scratches. One of them fell and was dragged into the haze before the others could react. The rest began to retreat in uneven steps, still firing but losing ground fast. Jace watched without moving, the shards deepening in tone, as if reacting to the violence. Then, without warning, the hum surged into a sharp pulse that made the straps of his backpack vibrate against his shoulders. He slipped behind the rock and pulled the pack into his lap, unfastening the top flap and reaching inside until his fingers closed around the wrapped shape of the shard. Even through the cloth it felt warm. He unwrapped it slowly, and the red glow spilled into the air around him, casting faint light on the nearby stone. The glow grew brighter in short rhythmic flashes, like a heartbeat speeding up, and with each pulse he felt a pressure in the air around him as if the space itself was tightening. He remembered the words his grandfather had told him long ago in the quiet of their small cabin. "If it finds you, run." And now he knew those words were meant for this moment. The ground beneath him trembled in a way that was no longer subtle, a low grinding vibration that made small stones roll across the surface. Somewhere far off a deep sound rose from the earth, like the groan of shifting mountains. It grew louder with each second. The cadets in the distance stopped firing and looked around, some stumbling as the vibration threw them off balance. The haze around them began to twist in strange spirals that rose higher into the air, and in the center of those spirals the cracked ground started to split. Jace wrapped the shard quickly and shoved it deep into the pack, tightening the straps before swinging it back over his shoulders. He moved fast toward a cluster of jagged rocks that offered better cover, keeping low as the vibration grew into a steady quake. The dust in the air began to glow faintly as if lit from below, and from the cracks in the earth a pale light seeped upward, not bright but cold and steady like moonlight trapped underground for too long. The cadets were shouting now, their voices full of panic as the ground beneath them shifted and broke. Long black shapes began to rise from the cracks, each one segmented and glistening with a dull sheen, their surfaces ridged like armor. The shapes unfolded into massive limbs that dug into the ground with clawed tips, lifting bodies that towered over the cadets. The creatures' heads turned slowly, eyes glowing the same dim orange he had seen before, their movements deliberate and heavy, the sound of their armor plates grinding together, carrying across the valley like distant thunder. One of the creatures turned its head toward Jace's direction, the hum of the shard inside his pack responding instantly with a sharp pulse that made his chest tighten. He moved quickly along the base of the ridge, keeping the rocks between himself and the towering shapes, his boots sliding on loose grit, but never stopping. The air behind him filled with the deep rumble of the creatures moving, each step making the ground shake beneath his feet. The cadence of their movement slow, but relentless, like a tide that could not be turned back. The ridge narrowed into a tight passage between two walls of stone, barely wide enough for him to squeeze through with his pack. He pressed into it and moved quickly, the walls closing out the sound of the wind and replacing it with the muffled echo of the quake. He emerged on the other side into a small basin surrounded by uneven stone, the ground here more solid and the air still. He dropped to one knee and listened, the hum of the shard returning to its slower rhythm, the quake fading into the distance, the sound of the cadets' weapons now gone, replaced by the wind once more. He stayed there for a long moment, breathing slowly, his eyes scanning the basin for any sign of movement. The dust here lay undisturbed except for his own tracks. He reached back to touch the pack, feeling the steady warmth of the shard inside, and he knew that whatever had happened back in the valley was not the end, but only the beginning. The creatures had risen for a reason, and the shard was connected to that reason. The thought pressed heavy against his mind as the silence around him grew, and somewhere far above the clouds rolled over each other in slow, endless motion, hiding whatever might be watching from the sky. The air was colder now, and the light had thinned into a pale gray that made every shadow seem longer and sharper. Jay stood at the edge of the basin looking toward the direction he had come from. The hum of the shard inside his backpack was slow and steady again, yet it carried a faint undertone, like the echo of distant thunder. The wind that reached him carried grit, but also something heavier, a faint vibration that traveled through the air and into his bones. He knew the creatures had not gone far. He knew they were still moving through the valley and closing in on whatever had survived their first rise. He moved quickly across the basin, climbing a ridge of black rock that gave him a view of the land ahead. The sight made his chest tighten. The remaining cadets were scattered across the cracked ground below, some trying to regroup, while others ran in broken lines toward higher ground. Their armor was scratched and their weapons burned low. The air around them shimmered with heat from repeated fire, but it was clear their energy packs were draining fast. The creatures moved behind and around them, towering shapes that pushed through the dust with slow, unstoppable steps, their orange eyes fixed on the cadets like predators measuring prey that had nowhere left to go. One of the cadets raised a weapon and fired into the largest of the shapes. The shot burst against its armored shell without even slowing it. The creature turned its head toward the source and began to move faster, its legs stabbing into the ground with each step. The sound of its movement a deep grinding scrape, that seemed to press into the earth itself. Another cadet shouted for them to fall back, but their voices were swallowed by the storm and the heavy sound of the hunt. Jace felt the shard in his pack give a single sharp pulse, as if responding to the danger. He crouched behind the ridge and pulled the pack into his lap. His hands moved to a hidden compartment stitched into the inner lining. The flap opened to reveal an object wrapped in thick oiled cloth. He unwrapped it with care, revealing a folded weapon that looked nothing like the sleek rifles of the cadets. It was heavier, its surface marked with deep engravings that seemed to catch what little light there was. The metal was dark and cold, and when he pressed a latch along the side, the weapon unfolded with a slow, deliberate click, the weight settling into his hands as if it had been made for him alone. The hum of the shard grew louder now, and he understood without question that the weapon and the shard were parts of the same thing. He pulled the shard from the pack and set it into a round socket at the weapon's core. It slid into place with a deep resonant tone that rolled through the air like the strike of a great bell. The engravings along the weapon began to glow with the same red light as the shard, and the hum turned into a low vibration that traveled up his arms and into his chest. He felt the air around him grow warmer, the cold of the basin breaking under the presence of the weapon's power. He climbed the ridge again and looked down at the battlefield. The cadets were falling back toward a jagged rise of stone, but the creatures were closing fast. He raised the weapon and aimed at the largest of them, the one that had shrugged off the cadets' fire. He squeezed the trigger, and the weapon roared, the sound not sharp like an energy rifle, but deep and heavy like the earth itself breaking. A beam of crimson light burst from the barrel, cutting through the dust in a straight line and striking the creature square in the chest. The impact threw it backward in a spray of shattered armor and black dust, the ground beneath it splitting from the force. The other creatures froze for a moment, their orange eyes turning toward the source of the attack. The cadets looked up as well, their faces hidden by visors, but their movements slowed in shock. Jace fired again, and another creature fell, its body crashing into the cracked ground with a sound like a collapsing building. But the remaining ones began to move toward him now, their steps shaking the ridge, the dust swirling in thick spirals around their legs as if drawn to them. He knew he could not take them all at once. The weapon's power was great, but it burned fast, and the hum of the shard warned him with each shot that it was not endless. He backed away from the ridge and moved along a narrow path that wound upward, the creatures following but slowed by the steep climb. He fired again, and the beam tore through the front legs of one, sending it crashing down the slope in a tumble of broken limbs and shards of armor. The rest pressed on, their movement slower, but still relentless. The sky above darkened further as clouds rolled in thick and low, the wind rising until it howled through the gaps in the rocks, carrying the smell of scorched armor and the faint metallic tang that seemed to follow the creatures everywhere. At the top of the path, he found a flat stretch of stone that jutted out over a deep chasm. The wind tore across it in violent bursts, the space behind him narrowing to a single passage. He knew this was the place where he could make a stand. He positioned himself at the center and steadied the weapon, the glow from its engravings lighting the rock beneath him in faint crimson patterns. The first of the creatures appeared in the narrow passage, its eyes burning brighter now, its legs moving with precision even on the uneven ground. Jace aimed and fired, the beam slamming into its chest and throwing it backward into the others, the passage filling with the sound of their screeches. He fired again and again, each shot shaking the air, the red glow of the weapon painting the dust in eerie light, the shard inside it pulsing harder with each strike, until the hum became a steady deep note that filled his ears and chest. The last creature lunged through the passage, but he met it with a shot that tore through its head and sent it collapsing in silence. The dust around him slowly settling as the echoes of the fight faded into the wind. The weapon's glow began to fade, and the hum grew softer, the shard's pulse slowing again. Jace lowered it and stepped back from the edge of the chasm, his breath steady despite the cold air that rushed over the rocks. Below in the valley the cadets were regrouping, their weapons lowered now, their eyes turned toward the ridge where he stood. None of them spoke, the wind carrying only the sound of grit moving over stone. Jace slung the weapon across his back and adjusted the straps of his pack, the shard's warmth pressing against him once more, and in that moment he knew the fight was not over, that the creatures were not the only threat here, and that whatever had sent them would not stop until it had taken back what he carried. The wind on the ridge carried the last traces of the dust from the battle, and the air felt different now. Colder yet clear, as if the storm itself was holding its breath. Jace stood with the weapon still slung across his back, and the weight of the shard warm against his spine inside the pack. The cadets below began to climb toward him in a loose and uneven line, their movements slow and careful, their weapons lowered but their eyes fixed on him as if unsure whether he was an ally or something else entirely. The silence between them stretched long, broken only by the low hum that still lingered from the shard, though it was softer now, almost like the fading echo of a bell. When the first of the cadets reached the top, they stopped a few steps away, their armor dull under the pale light, and their visors hiding their faces. One of them spoke with a voice that carried both exhaustion and disbelief, asking what the weapon was and how he had taken down the creatures when none of their tech had worked. Jace gave no answer at first, his eyes scanning the horizon beyond them, the dark clouds rolling low over the cracked land, the shapes of distant hills half swallowed by haze. He knew the question was not simple, and the answer would not change what needed to happen next. Finally he told them only that the weapon was not made here, and neither was the shard, and that they were never meant to be used except when there was no other choice. The cadets exchanged quick glances, though their expressions were still hidden. One of them asked if the creatures were gone, and Jace shook his head, telling them they had only been driven back, and that the ground beneath this planet was not empty. He told them there were older things here that moved in the dark places, and that the shard was a key they recognized, not because they wanted it, but because they feared it. The wind picked up again as he spoke, the sound whistling through the cracks in the ridge like a low warning. They began to move together toward the far side of the ridge, where the land sloped down into a narrow pass. The ground here was smoother, as if something large had moved across it many times before. Jace kept his step steady, the cadets following in a loose formation, their earlier confidence gone and replaced with the wary silence of those who had seen something far outside their training. As they moved, the hum of the shard grew faintly stronger again, pulsing in slow, regular beats that seemed to match the rhythm of the wind, each pulse making the air feel heavier for just a moment before easing again. The pass opened into a wide, flat stretch of land where the dust was thin and patches of dark stone were visible beneath. The stones were carved with shallow lines that formed twisting patterns, some spirals, some branching like veins. The lines glowed faintly in the dim light, not bright enough to see from afar, but clear when standing over them. Jace knelt beside one and placed his palm against the surface. The warmth that met his hand was the same as the warmth of the shard, a steady heat that felt alive. The cadets gathered around but kept their distance, uneasy with the way the pattern seemed to shift when looked at too long. Jace reached into his pack and drew out the shard, its red glow spilling over the patterns on the stone and making them flare brighter. The hum deepened until it seemed to come from the ground itself. The air pressed against them like a slow rising tide. One of the cadets stepped forward to touch the stone, but Jace stopped them with a sharp glance, telling them the patterns were not made for human hands and that they were not here to open what lay beneath, only to keep it closed. His voice was calm but carried an edge that made them step back. He placed the shard back into the pack and tightened the straps, the glow fading again though the warmth lingered, the hum softening to a low background rhythm. The cadets looked at each other with a mix of confusion and unease. One of them asked what was under the stone, and Jace told them only that it was something their weapons could not fight and their armor could not protect them from, something that moved slowly but never stopped, and that the creatures they had fought were only its guardians, shaped to prevent anyone from reaching the deeper places. They left the flat stones behind and followed the slope downward, the clouds above shifting to reveal a narrow band of pale light that fell across the land ahead. In the distance, the dark shape of the extraction ship sat low on the horizon, its engines silent. The sight brought a flicker of relief to the cadets, though they did not quicken their pace. Jace kept his eyes moving, watching the ridges on either side, the way the dust curled in small spirals along the ground. He knew the land was never truly empty, and that silence here was as dangerous as sound. When they reached the edge of the last ridge before the ship, Jace stopped and told the cadets to go on ahead. They hesitated, but his voice left no space for argument. One of them asked if he was coming with them, and he said he would follow. that he needed to make sure nothing else moved out of the valley before they left. They began to move down the slope toward the ship, their figures small against the cracked ground, the wind carrying them away until they were only shapes in the pale light. Jace turned back toward the land they had crossed, the hum of the shard now faint but steady, his eyes tracing the distant ridges and the deep-shadowed places between them. He thought of the man who had given him the pack, and the quiet weight in his words when he had told him to keep it close. He understood now that the pack had never been about the gear inside, but about the trust placed in him to carry something that could not fall into the wrong hands. He tightened the straps once more and began to walk toward the far side of the ridge, his steps slow and deliberate. The clouds above closed again, the light fading back into the same dim gray. The wind shifted and carried with it a sound that made him pause, a low, deep rumble like the first beat of a drum far underground. It was not loud, but it was enough to make the dust at his feet tremble. He knew the creatures were not gone, only waiting. He knew they would rise again if the shard was used in the wrong place or at the wrong time. He turned his head toward the ship in the distance and saw the cadets climbing aboard, their forms swallowed by the open hatch, the engines beginning to glow faintly in the haze. He stood there for a long moment, the hum of the shard steady in the air around him, the land silent except for the wind. And then he began to move again, not toward the ship, but along the ridge toward the places where the land dipped into shadow, the places where the patterns on the stones might connect to something deeper. He knew this was not the end of the test, not for him, and that survival here was not just about living through the night, but about making sure the night itself did not reach beyond this world. His figure faded into the haze, the old backpack tight against his shoulders, the glow of the shard hidden but alive, waiting for the moment it would be needed again.